This week, we're going to continue looking at the subsets of state government and discuss metropolitics, which is looking at how we govern large metropolitan areas, which is really just a collection of multiple local governments. And just keeping in mind, these can also often even cross state lines, right? You can think of these large metropolitan areas where you can actually have two or maybe even three states involved in what would be considered the whole large metropolitan area. In fact, that's often the case. And so this can make things even more difficult. There's often differences in taxes and taxable income across these different local units within a state. And then, of course, that's even more compounded when you're talking about different states, which can create significant differences in local services across seemingly connected areas. So metropolitan areas are basically they're large areas that are socially and usually economically integrated, and typically around one or more large or major city. But there's usually no political or governmental connection, right? So there's not usually one government for the whole area, even though you have these large expansive areas. So it's often known as the missing level of government, and it will requires coordination of the different local governments in order to ensure services, transportation, utilities, as well as things like that. So, for example, I know at least from where I grew up with my parents, they lived right on a county line, and you knew which part of the road was resurfaced by which county, because one county at the time had more money and the other county did not have as much income coming in. It's actually been reversed in recent years, so now it's kind of the other way around. I think the poorer county might be getting more grant money. You also see this often with snow removal, right? You can be driving along, if you're ever driving when there's snow and snow removal, you can often see variations or differences, right, when you cross certain lines, whether it's county or town lines. The services are different. Can often see better snow removal in certain areas and not as good in others. And again, they're regional, so they're not part of really our government structure. When we talk about federalism, right? We talk about local, state, and then national politics and governments. And metropolitan areas are really regional governments, or lack of, right? We don't actually have that because it's a part of a state, but larger than a local government, but smaller than a full state. And you can also get like what are known as megapolises or mega regions, where it's more than one large city or major city. So the Twin Cities would be an example of this. So there's some different variations out there. So if you think of large cities and how they develop, and if you've lived around a large city, if you especially in Chicago, you kind of see the development taking place, especially when a city is in a growth phase. And this is often known as sprawl, as you basically see people from the city moving out further and further. And again, so areas that were basically farmlands when I was in high school are now subdivisions, right? So one of the busiest intersections off of Route 55, about an hour outside of Chicago, wasn't there was nothing there when I was in high school. Actually, it was what if anybody's been up that way, right? Weber Road, is a major intersection, a major ramp off. My aunt and uncle lived not far from there at the time, and there was nothing. You got off, and it was basically again just filled. We were happy when a fast food place popped up, and now again it's one of the major intersections um, that's right there. And so you see this sprawl, and it takes place. So when we're talking sprawl, there's a lot of things that people get concerned about. One of those is zoning laws. So a lot of zoning laws are set up anymore that they're single use. So one of the things that's different in a city as opposed to when you get out into these suburban areas is that in the city, right, you can, and again, we talked about in the local, one of the local articles, right, you can kind of get to all of your amenities within a 15-minute walking distance because it has multi-use purposes. When you get out into the suburbs, you see zoning for single use, right? So you have industry, you have commercial, you have residential. And there's a whole big block that's all that's there. So that requires you then to have to drive from one area to the other. So, right, if you live in your residential, you're going to have to drive a significant distance. I mean, it may not be real bad, but it's more than a walking distance to get to your grocery and other essentials. They also tend to prefer low density development, right? So you don't see a lot of apartments and things like that growing up in the suburbs. They're single family houses. That's what they're going out there and developing. You can also see what's known as leapfrog developing. So often maybe some land isn't as desirable or they can't get it purchased and there's, cheaper or more easy to develop land. And so certain areas will get leapfrogged and then they don't get developed. Maybe eventually they will, but not always. And this can make it difficult on um, connecting services, right? So if you have this farmland in between residential houses, you have to still be able to connect services to them, and it's going to take more, require a little more effort to get the services out to those areas. So kind of going along with that, it's also the term edgeless cities, so much like the sprawl. So people work and live in their different communities, right? And again, we talked about with the lack of connection, there's often disparate tax bases. So those living in inner cities often have less money to spend on schools than those living in out in the suburbs. And part of that's again because their choices. A lot of people choose certain communities, especially outside an hour or so outside of a city, because they're willing to pay higher percentage of their taxes on on their property to go to their school. So their school does have additional amenities. So there's choices that they're making by moving out to these suburbs. You also can then again see concentrated wealth because those people who are willing to pay also tend to have more of the wealth. Not always, but most likely. And there's then becomes this disparity in public service delivery. As well as and this is kind of often known as what suburban flight, this flight out from the cities out to these suburban communities where they can sort of have and choose to have these higher amenities. All right, so kind of tying into that as you're looking at metropolitan growth is oftentimes you will see land that gets annexed, or you'll hear about a land that gets annexed. Sometimes it's voluntary that an area wants to be, pulled into a town or city, but oftentimes it's not. Usually it's whoever has the power. The larger city usually or a town is going to have more power to annex a smaller town or city or just area into their right. So it's incorporating or annexing land into their borders or boundaries. Now, the benefit of that is then the services then apply to them, right? So if you live outside of a city boundary, you often don't get city services, but if you get an annex within that city boundary, then city services become you get those. But you also means you're probably paying for them as well. So costs often go up. And then there's also been a lot of discussion about regional governments. So Portland, Oregon is a good example in the U.S., but there's not a lot of good examples of this. But there's a lot of talk of adding some regional governments in these areas, whether they're regional councils, metropolitan planning organizations, interjurisdictional agreements, government consolidation, city-county consolidation. So Chicago is not a good example of this because there's multiple counties in that metropolitan area. But you can see it in maybe some smaller towns or smaller city metropolitan areas where the whole thing is within a county. So maybe you expand the jurisdiction or put the level of government up at the county level. So that would work in some areas, but not all. So there's a lot of discussion about, maybe how things could be better, but there's also a lot of people that, really say, hey, just let it go, plan as the way it's been going and let it just work, kind of letting the market work for itself is sort of the idea, right? So, I mean, has been some gentrification of some of these as things, because that's one of the arguments, right? Is that as people expand and do it, things shift and change, and you leave these abandoned buildings, abandoned spaces behind as populations shift and sort of move out. But there has been an increase in what's known as gentrification, which is going back into some of these abandoned neighborhoods or cities and helping to kind of reform them, which is good. But it also has a downside as well because it often prices out people who might live there still, who haven't been maybe necessarily able to afford to move out to leave this area that's been abandoned. And now by coming in and doing gentrification, you're now sort of forcing them because the prices of it now become unaffordable for them to continue to live there. Most of the people that are sort of against reform are those who talk about, again, that market intervention, allowing people to choose their neighborhoods that fit their needs. What are you willing to pay and what services are you going to require? Some people would rather pay less and have less services. So public choice model or the tie-out model both sort of talk about this, right? Everybody's sort of having this, deciding or moving with their feet. They're going to pick the neighborhood that makes the most sense for them. So it doesn't make sense for all of these areas to have the exact same requirements, because not everybody or not exact same services and pay the exact same taxes, because not everybody wants the same level of service and not everybody's willing to pay the same level of taxes. So let people choose which areas based on what they want. Again, in theory, this sounds really great. And if it could be done perfectly, it probably would. But of course, there are some downsides to that as well. And it's not always carried out, right? Um, there's some holes or gaps that can get left in that as well. Not everybody's necessarily allowed to do that. And I mean, say if you have a whole bunch of people, retired people who don't have kids, who move into districts with low um, that want low property taxes and don't want to pay for their schools, but you still have kids in that district with schools, those kids are going to be hurt, and the families that can't necessarily move out are going to be hurt. So there again, there has to be some sort of balance between the two. All right, so last we'll talk about rural metropolitics. So kind of the same thing, but just it happens to some extent in the rural politics, but for the opposite reason, right? So we talk about it in the metropolitan regions because they're expanding and growing and more people are moving in. Well, they're moving in because they're moving out of rural areas. So the rural flight has been well documented, as younger people tend to move closer to larger cities and within those areas, especially those who and again, the higher paying jobs tend to be in those areas, so a lot of your wealth moves there as well, especially as farming also becomes more and more corporate, right? You have fewer and fewer family farms who are the ones making up a lot of the rural populations. And often these people, a lot of times, what states and local governments have been trying to do is consolidate services and their governments, right? So, instead of having two or three different schools, high schools or grade schools, or three different governments, which are all going to cost more money, they'll try to consolidate. And maybe you've heard, I mean, there have been school districts that have done this. But the interesting thing is that when forced to choose between higher taxes and fewer services or losing their local government, or local services or local schools, most, not all, but most rural communities have actually chosen to keep things the way they are. They've chosen to pay more in taxes and get fewer services in order to continue to have their sort of local community, right? They aren't willing to lose that sense of local belonging, which can happen when you consolidate and then you create this sort of corporate or mega district that doesn't have the same local feel. Again, one of the reasons a lot of people stay in the rural areas is because they like that local feel. So it makes sense that why they would maybe choose not to not to have those metropolitics and there's some of their their consolidated services in the lower areas. All right, so that is Metropolitics, and again, a lot of things to think about as we see a lot of the populations continue to shift and change in the U.S.